His world ended that morning, no discussion, no hope of appeal. And then as night fell, a little girl vanished into a blinding snowstorm. A furious wind screamed through the pines as falling snow swallowed every trace of life. Yet the man just cast aside was the one soul who dared to step into the void. At his side, a frail, old dog pressed on, driven by pure instinct, its strength long since faded. Beyond the yellow tape, the woman who had ended his career stood paralyzed, witnessing the man she cast off march into that tempest for her own daughter. No one pleaded for him to go. No one believed he would return. What unfolded in the moments ahead transcended all rules and job titles. It was about the heart of a person when another's life hangs in the balance. Before our story unfolds, let us know where you're joining us from. If this story touches your soul, please subscribe so you'll always be with us for more stories of devotion, bravery, and spirit. Your support is our everything. Heavy snow blanketed the windows of Spokane General Hospital, descending in thick, hushed sheets as midnight stole through the halls, where the building thrummed with machines that simply could not be allowed to fail. Daniel Cross was a solitary figure in the mechanical room deep below the surgical wing. His shoulders slightly stooped, his boots fixed in a shallow pool of condensed steam. At 38, he appeared older than his years, a weariness not born of sickness, but from a lifetime of hardware. His face was sharp and weathered, his square jaw obscured by a short, patchy beard he tended to only when he thought of it. His dark hair, cut close for function, not fashion, was already streaked with premature gray. His hands were calloused, etched with a permanent network of fine cuts and old burns, the kind of marks earned honestly over time. Daniel had on a faded work jacket, the North Cascade Mechanical Services emblem cracked and peeling from its chest. Dark oil stains marred the sleeves. The tips of his gloves were worn through. A faint scent of metal grease and old steam clung to him. He always carried that scent. He worked the night shifts, answered the urgent calls, and took the jobs other techs would quietly refuse. Not for the enjoyment, but for the extra pay. And because no one ever fought him for the trouble. Just then, behind him, the hospital's main steam pressure gauge faltered once more. Daniel saw it before the alarm even completed its cycle. He felt no panic. He seldom did. Panic was just wasted time. He knelt, pressing 2 fingers firmly against the return line. He closed his eyes, feeling the pulse of the pipe against his hand. A faint shudder, an offbeat rhythm. He tilted his head, listening not with instruments, but with something deeper, with memory. The sound echoed a forgotten place, a name just out of reach. Suddenly, a nurse burst into the room, gasping for breath. Sarah Mitchell, in her early 30s, tall and willowy, her fair skin flushed from her frantic dash, her dark blonde hair hastily tied back. Her eyes were piercing, intelligent, yet held a fear that years in the hospital couldn't erase. "Maintenance reports unstable pressure," she rushed. "OR3 has a pediatric heart surgery in 20 minutes. Daniel glanced up, his expression calm, impossible to read. "If that steam pressure falls any further, they'll have to postpone." Sarah swallowed hard. "The surgeons are already scrubbed." A single deliberate nod from Daniel. Company protocol was clear. This demanded an escalation. A supervisor, a complete sensor replacement, a full digital calibration. At least 90 minutes. Far too long. Daniel's eyes went to the secondary sensor housing, and he spotted it instantly. A buildup of moisture condensation, skewing the readings, a classic problem in these aging hospital systems. A simple fix if you were willing to ignore the rulebook. He knew the procedure. He also knew the consequences of defying it. From his tool bag, Daniel retrieved a battered analog pressure gauge. Its glass was scarred, its metal muted by years of service. The younger techs would mock it, calling it a relic. But he trusted it more than any modern digital display. He shut down the auxiliary loop manually, bleeding the excess steam, his gaze fixed on the needle as it settled with unwavering precision. He then adjusted the main valve, guided not by a screen, but by the feel of the pressure, the heat, by pure instinct. A temporary field bypass, clean and effective. Above them, the system quieted. The pressure held steady. The piercing alarm went silent. Sarah's gaze locked on the gauge, then on him. Is that authorized? Daniel wiped his hands on his worn jacket, adding a fresh stain. It will hold. That's not what I asked. Daniel's eyes met hers for a fleeting moment. There was no arrogance, no pride, only a deep, unwavering certainty. The surgery will not be delayed. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah nodded. Thank you. She turned and fled. Daniel remained, watching over the system. His reflection shimmered faintly in the polished steel paneling. For just a moment, he let his mind wander to why he always chose swiftness over caution action, over authorization. Because waiting had cost him everything once before. He forced the memory away. He was completely unaware that the hospital's internal cameras were documenting his every move. The analog gauge, the manual release, the bypass, all performed with a practiced grace that was unthinkable for a simple HVAC technician. Upstairs, a child's heart was saved, the surgery completed on time. Down below, Daniel packed his tools in a heavy silence. When he stepped out into the swirling snow, his phone vibrated. A routine system notification from North Cascade. Activity logged. Deviation flagged. Daniel didn't bother reading the rest. He knew precisely what was coming next. The morning arrived gray and fragile. The sort of Spokane winter dawn where the daylight felt thin, almost an illusion. The previous night's snow had turned to a dirty slush along the hospital's loading dock, scarred with tire marks and streaks of salt. Daniel Cross hadn't returned home. He sat on a low concrete barrier by the service entrance, a paper cup of coffee turning cold in his grasp. His jacket was still marked by the night's work. The scent of oil and steam seemed baked into the very fabric. Exhaustion was etched on his face, but he was composed in the way of men who have learned that reacting achieves nothing. Inside the hospital was coming to life. Nurses were changing shifts, orderlies guided their carts. And somewhere above him, a child's heart beat strong and steady because a room remained warm. Daniel wouldn't allow himself to dwell on it. In the hospital's maintenance office, Mark Henson hovered nervously near a desk, rubbing his damp palms together. Mark was in his early 40s, thick around his midsection, with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He was a field lead for North Cascade Mechanical Services, the kind of man who followed manuals to the letter, believing they were the only thing that kept the world from falling apart. Mark had already reviewed the security footage 3 times. He had watched Daniel isolate the auxiliary sensor. He had seen the analog gauge. He had seen the bypass. It had worked. That right there was the problem. Mark knew enough to recognize that the repair was brilliant. He also knew enough to imagine the consequences if it ever failed. Lawsuits don't care about intentions, no matter how noble. Neither does the crushing weight of corporate liability. And so, he launched his laptop, attaching the chilling still frames from the hospital's surveillance feed, and began to compose the report. An unauthorized procedure, a flagrant deviation from protocol, a massive legal exposure. He hit send. Miles away in a glass office overlooking the Spokane River, Claire Whitmore read the entire email on her feet. Claire was 35, and she moved with the controlled stillness of a person who had learned never to show a moment of doubt. She was tall, with a lean, disciplined body, her spine straight, even in the solitude of her office. Her dark hair fell just past her shoulders, impeccably smooth and precisely cut, never daring to be out of place. Her skin was a pale, flawless canvas, untouched by restless nights, though delicate lines had started to gather at the corners of her eyes, etched there by years of vigilance, not of age. Claire had taken the reins of North Cascade 2 years prior, rebuilding it with a relentless, unwavering focus. She trusted in systems, in rules, in predictability. People she had learned through bitter experience were infinitely more fallible than any machine. A muscle in her jaw tightened as she scrolled through the damning report. A technician ignoring safety protocols in a place like this was not a simple mistake. It was a direct threat to her company, to her name, to the fragile stability she had bled to create. She didn't dial legal. She didn't summon HR. She took her coat from the back of her chair and left. Claire swept into Spokane General Hospital just before the stroke of noon. The lobby thrummed with the chaos of a weekday, a symphony of squeaking shoes on tile and muffled announcements from above. But as she moved through the space, conversations instinctively fell to a whisper. Authority always had that silencing effect. Daniel was hidden back in the mechanical wing, finalizing the paperwork for his temporary fix. He glanced up at the sound of footsteps and saw her immediately. Claire Whitmore didn't hurry. She never hesitated. She stopped just a few feet away, her eyes cataloging the stained jacket, the worn gloves tucked into his back pocket, and the analog gauge resting on his cart like a silent accusation. "You're Daniel Cross," she stated. "Yes, ma'am." Her tone was level, almost disarmingly gentle. "You bypassed a pressure sensor without authorization." "Yes." "You violated company safety protocol." "Yes." Claire's eyes flickered to Mark Henson, who stood nearby, rigid with an almost unbearable discomfort. There were no questions, no inquiry into the why. Her gaze found Daniel's again as she said, effective immediately, "Your employment with North Cascade Mechanical Services is terminated." The words weren't shouted, yet they struck with the clean, sharp edge of a surgeon's scalpel. In the sterile quiet of the hallway, a few hospital staff slowed their hurried pace, their ears catching the sudden chill. Sarah Mitchell stood frozen near the nurse's station, her hands twisting together, her eyes darting between Daniel's still form, and the woman she now understood held his entire world in her hands. Daniel offered no argument. He simply straightened his back, wiping his hands slowly on his jacket, a hollow gesture buying time he knew he couldn't spend. "I understand," he breathed. A silence stretched between them, thin and taut. "There's just one thing I need to ask," Daniel pressed on, his voice unwavering yet sinking to a more desperate pitch. "Can I just finish the monitoring window? It's another hour. I need the pay." For a fleeting moment, Claire's gaze dropped to the paperwork on his cart. "No," she clipped out. "You should have considered the consequences before you ignored protocol." And with that, she turned her back on him. Daniel watched her retreat down the long corridor, the soft click of her heels on the tile echoing like a final judgment. He didn't plead. He didn't shout. The unspoken words of the surgery of the child of the pressure gauge holding true died on his lips. In a heavy silence, he packed his tools. The moment he stepped back outside, the frigid air sliced through his jacket, a brutal, immediate shock. He pulled the thin fabric tighter around himself, his breath a white cloud in the biting air. From the depths of his pocket, his phone vibrated with a ghost's touch, an automatic monthly reminder. A ghost he couldn't bear to face? He ignored it. And so Daniel Cross walked away from Spokane General Hospital, just as he'd walked away from everything else that had ever mattered quietly, letting no one see the crushing weight of what it would cost him. That night under a starless sky, Daniel Cross drove north, chasing the darkness toward Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. A dusting of snow clung to the highway's shoulders, illuminated in the lonely yellow glow of the streetlights. His work jacket still carried the scent of oil, of steam of metal. He left the window sealed shut. Some nights he needed the lingering smell to remind him he was still breathing. The house was a modest, single-story sanctuary tucked away on a quiet residential street. As Daniel turned the key and pushed open the door, a warm kitchen light spilled out, painting a golden path across the worn wooden floors. Before the door could click shut, a figure began to stir, rising slowly from the deepest shadows. Atlas, the old German shepherd, nearly 10 years of age, his once profound black and tan coat, now beautifully streaked with the silver of time along his muzzle and chest. A tremor of stiffness ran through his back legs as he stood, his breath catching with an unnatural weight. A faint, painful rasp hidden in each inhale, but his eyes were still sharp, still devoted, still watching Daniel exactly as he always had. "Hey, old man," Daniel whispered. A single heavy thump from Atlas's tail answered him. It was all the strength he could summon. Daniel knelt, ignoring the protest from his own knees, and laid his palm gently over Atlas's heart. He counted the beats instinctively, a desperate ritual like a prayer. Too rapid, too unsteady. He reached for the little wooden box that held a permanent vigil on the kitchen table and lifted its lid. Inside were pill bottles, all labeled with care, and a folded sheet of directions deeply creased from use. Atlas took the medication with quiet trust. He always did. The house was steeped in a quiet, so deliberate, it felt as if the walls had long ago decided against making a sound. Daniel poured a glass of water and leaned on the counter, watching, as Atlas carefully lowered himself onto the rug beside the heater. In the stillness, a memory surfaced, uninvited. His mother, Eleanor Cross, had succumbed to lung cancer when Daniel was 29. She had been a delicate woman with soft hands and tired eyes, the kind of soul who would apologize when she was entirely blameless. The illness claimed her with brutal swiftness. The laughter abandoned the house the same day she did. It wasn't a gradual emptiness, just a sudden crushing absence. And after that, it was only his father and Atlas. Michael Cross had been a man with broad shoulders, but a quiet voice and a stance that spoke of endless patience more than strength. He brought Atlas home from a canine rescue in Washington state after the dog was considered too old for service. Even then, Atlas was disciplined. Trained to sit, to wait, to watch, he followed Michael everywhere, sleeping like a sentry at the foot of his bed, and lay beside his chair each evening, guarding against a sorrow only he could perceive. It was 2 winters after Eleanor's death that Atlas fell into respiratory distress deep in the night. Michael acted instantly. He didn't call the neighbors. He didn't wait for daylight. He eased Atlas into the passenger seat and drove toward the only veterinary clinic still open, down a winding mountain road slick with a treacherous sheet of ice. Daniel was out of state that night. The car never made it through the pass. The call came in the fragile light just before dawn. In that instant, Atlas was no longer a dog. He was everything that remained, a living, breathing promise Daniel hadn't been there to uphold. Daniel collapsed into the chair facing Atlas, his head falling heavy against the wall. Sleep was a fractured thing now, and when it did come, it only summoned another memory, sharper, louder, born of scorching heat, not cold of choking dust, not snow. The sound of wind howling through the skeletal husks of concrete buildings. Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Daniel wore a different uniform back then. He had been a lieutenant with SEAL Team 4, entrusted with navigation and extraction timing for a joint operation targeting a high-value insurgent logistics chief. The objective had been met with clinical precision. The target was eliminated. The problem began after intelligence gave the all-clear on their withdrawal route, or so they were led to believe. A ghost force, undocumented, and waiting closed the net as the team moved out. The ambush was a blur of violence too fast to correct. Daniel survived. 3 of his brothers did not. He still sees their faces in his sleep, hears their voices through a haze of radio static and memory. He endlessly retraces the maps in his mind, tormented by the conviction that there was a sign he'd missed, a detail he'd overlooked, an instinct he should have trusted. The Navy never forced his hand. Daniel walked away on his own terms. No ceremony, no speeches, no medals to gather dust on a wall. He turned in his gear and vanished, carrying the unbearable weight of a mission that was a success on paper and a catastrophic failure everywhere else. He chose a life lived in the shadows. Technical work, solitary field calls, long hours jobs where being invisible was a virtue. The money was quietly funneled into therapy he never spoke of, and the medication Atlas would need for the rest of his life. Daniel leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I've got you," he whispered into the stillness. Atlas lifted his head, ears twitching at the sound of his name. He didn't have to move closer. The space between them was already filled. Outside, the snow fell relentlessly. Inside, Daniel remained awake, listening to the steady, anchoring rhythm of Atlas's breath, making a silent vow that this time he wouldn't run. Not from the dog, not from the promise. Never again. A week later, a letter arrived. It was printed on heavy hospital letterhead, addressed with stark formality to the executive office of North Cascade Mechanical Services. Claire Whitmore read it in solitude, long after the building had emptied, and the city's pulse outside her window had softened to a murmur. Her desk lamp cast a solitary beam of light across a landscape of meticulously stacked folders, each color-coded and aligned with surgical precision. For her order was not a preference, it was a shield. The letter itself was a study in formality, polite and painstakingly precise. It offered gratitude to North Cascade for the urgent restoration of the hospital's vital steam system, emphasizing that their swift stabilization had permitted a critical pediatric cardiac surgery to proceed without interruption. The closing line confirmed the child was recovering well. Claire's eyes traced that sentence a second time before she carefully set the letter down, her fingertips barely grazing the paper as she leaned back in her chair. At 35, Claire's composure was so absolute it bordered on severe. Her posture remained impeccably straight, her shoulders squared a habit even in the profound quiet of her office. Dark hair framed her face in stark, deliberate lines. Her skin was pale, appearing almost translucent in the lamplight, and her expression, typically an unreadable mask, was now visibly unsettled. Her spirit was fractured by a terror she could not yet name. Peaceful rest had been stolen from her since the hospital visit. Claire swiveled to her computer, opening a secure internal request. She requisitioned the complete technical camera footage from the hospital's boiler room, not the standard overview feed, but the detailed close-up angles, the ones almost no one ever bothered to watch. The files arrived moments later. On her screen, the image of Daniel Cross materialized, frozen in a frame of surprising grainy clarity. An oil-streaked jacket, battered gloves, and a face she suddenly understood she had never truly seen. She pressed play. She observed him isolate the auxiliary sensor, his movements measured, not rushed, never reckless. She noted how his shoulders stayed relaxed, even as the pressure mounted. His hands moved with a profound economy. Not a single motion was wasted. There was no checklist, no moment of hesitation. He was simply reacting to the system in real time. Claire paused the playback, leaning toward the screen. Daniel was adjusting the main valve by touch alone, his eyes darting between the analog gauge and the steam line itself, responding to shifts before the digital display could even register them. He bled off the excess pressure by hand, then delicately fine-tuned the balance with small, intuitive adjustments, in precise, calculated steps. The system returned to stability. Claire felt a knot tighten deep in her chest. This was no accident. It wasn't carelessness. It was the work of a master forged somewhere far beyond the sterile environments she held sacred. She replayed the footage once more, each frame moving in slow motion. Nothing in their training manuals could explain this. No corporate retreat. And yet it had worked flawlessly. Claire shut her eyes for a moment, and an old wound, a memory, surfaced without warning. A younger version of herself, standing in a bank lobby years ago, clutching her newborn daughter to her chest. Lucy had been barely a week in the world, her impossibly small face nestled against Claire's shoulder, blissfully unaware of the terror that coursed through her mother's veins. Claire could still feel the chill of the marble through her shoes, the hollow silence after the bank manager explained the accounts were frozen. Her husband, Thomas Whitmore, had signed away their future with contracts she never saw, with loans disguised as clever investments, alliances built on a foundation of deceit. He had been so charming, so articulate, so utterly convincing. He had smiled right through it all, and Claire had believed him. When the truth finally clawed its way to the surface, it shattered the very world she thought was real. The company was on the verge of ruin. Lawsuits descended like vultures. And then, in a twist of fate so cruel she could never truly grasp it, Thomas died in a collision of his own drunken making before he could ever face the consequences of what he had done. The world saw her as a widow, In her heart, she was a survivor. With a discipline forged in fire, she dragged North Cascade back from the abyss. She purged every ounce of ambiguity. She buried instinct under layers of procedure, replacing every hint of trust with cold, hard verification. She put her faith in systems because systems don't betray you. People do. Claire's eyes snapped open, her gaze fixed on the screen. But Daniel Cross, he didn't fit into any system she had ever conceived. She remembered him in the hospital hallway, so quiet, so compliant, and how easily she had dismissed him, how clean and final it had felt. Control restored, risk neutralized. Now as she watched this footage, that perfect certainty began to splinter. Claire minimized the video and pulled up Daniel's personnel file. It was sparse, nearly empty. No commendations, but no complaints either. Just a steady record of night shifts and urgent call-outs. A technician who never seemed to refuse a job and never once filed for an overtime adjustment. Then her eyes caught something else. His file too was filled with pleas for time off, never for himself. Each request was modest, meticulously recorded, for veterinary care. A wave of understanding washed over Claire as she shut the folder. Across her desk, the hospital's letter pulsed with a life of its own, its polite words suddenly crushing her with unspoken weight. She had terminated a man who broke the rules to save a life, and she had cast him out without a single question. Claire rose, drawn to the window, her arms a tight shield across her heart. Outside, Spokane's lights shimmered on the river's surface, a cold, indifferent constellation. She whispered the lie to herself that she had done the right thing. That protocol was paramount, more vital than the human cost. But in the silence of that night, for the first time in an age, Claire Whitmore faced the harrowing possibility that she was wrong, and that fear was more profound than any risk she had ever calculated. 3 months later, a deep winter descended upon northern Idaho, blanketing everything in a hushed stillness. High above Lake Pendoraila, the Schweitzer Mountain Resort rested shrouded in silence, its great wooden lodges half swallowed by the fresh snow. The air was sharp and pure, the kind that made each breath feel like a conscious choice. Along the slopes, immense pines stood like silent, rigid sentinels, their boughs heavy and still, as if the very forest were holding its breath. Claire Whitmore arrived just past noon, her daughter at her side. Lucy was only 5 years old, small for her years, with fine brown hair that danced free of any restraint and wide gray eyes that seemed to absorb the world. She clutched a pink knit hat in one hand, skipping beside her mother as her boots made joyful crunches in the pristine snow. For Lucy, this place was a snow-filled wonderland. For Claire, it was a reckoning. This was no vacation. It was an atonement. Claire wore a long, charcoal gray wool coat, impeccably tailored against the biting cold. Her posture remained a study in control, perfectly composed, but the rigid line of her shoulders betrayed a soul utterly foreign to this profound quiet. Her hand moved to her phone out of pure reflex, then slid it back into her pocket. There were no board meetings, no quarterly reports. There was only Lucy. At that very moment, on the far side of the resort, Daniel Cross knelt before an open service panel inside the central heating building. Steam hissed softly around him. He wore the same oil-stained coveralls that had become his second skin. Patched over one knee, the cuffs darkened from years of honest labor. His beard had grown fuller, its edges less carefully tended to, and the sleepless nights had etched weary lines deeper into his face. Behind him, his loyal companion, Atlas, rested on the cold concrete, his old bones curled tightly, seeking the faint warmth from a vent. The once dark muzzle of the German shepherd had faded to a soft silver, and each breath he took was a shallow, uneven sound in the quiet room. Yet his ears twitched at Daniel's slightest movement, ever watchful. The Schweitzer job was a necessity for Daniel. It paid in cash under the table, and the resort was desperate for a quick fix. A critical heat exchanger was failing, threatening to close an entire wing of the lodge. His new supervisor didn't probe, didn't ask questions. Men like Daniel who could disappear into the work were valuable that way. Stay, Daniel murmured, his voice barely a whisper, as he tapped the floor beside Atlas with 2 fingers. The old dog remained perfectly still. He was a creature of perfect obedience. By mid-afternoon, a sinister shift began in the sky. The gentle flurry of snow intensified without warning, becoming a thick, blinding curtain. A fierce wind howled up from the ridge, driving the snow into a horizontal frenzy that tore through the trees. The world dissolved, shrinking into a chaotic blur of white and shifting shadows. For Claire, the realization of the danger came far too late. She and her little Lucy had wandered down a marked trail just far enough from the resort to feel like their own private winter wonderland. Lucy, full of joy, had begged for just one more picture, posing against snow-laden branches, her laughter echoing as delicate snowflakes collected in her hair. Claire knelt, adjusting her phone to perfectly frame her daughter's innocent smile. For just a moment, her entire world narrowed to that tiny screen. When she lifted her eyes, the world had shattered. Lucy was gone. "Lucy!" Claire called out, her voice still light with a playful tone. Silence answered her. She spun in a slow, desperate circle, her eyes scanning the darkening woods, the now empty trail. The falling snow was already erasing any trace of her daughter's path. "Lucy!" she cried, her voice raw with rising fear, but the wind stole the name from her lips. The panic didn't crash over her like a wave. It settled in her chest like a block of ice, cold and heavy. Her frantic walk turned into a desperate stumbling run. Her boots slid uselessly on the packed ice as she screamed Lucy's name until her throat was fire. There was nothing. By the time she burst back into the lodge, her hands were trembling so violently she couldn't control them. Once the staff understood the horror of the situation, they moved with urgent purpose. The sharp crackle of radios filled the air. A command was issued for all guests to stay indoors. Then, a chilling announcement echoed from the resort's loudspeakers. "Attention all guests. We are actively searching for a missing child. Her name is Lucy Whitmore. She is 5 years old, last seen wearing a pink hat and a blue jacket. If you have any information, please report it immediately." Down in the belly of the mechanical room, Daniel heard the words, and he froze. The name pierced his consciousness, sharp and absolute. Whitmore. 5 years old. A little pink hat. He froze for a heartbeat, every nerve ending screaming a silent alarm. Then his wrench fell, its metallic cry echoing on the concrete as he began to move. Daniel emerged into the biting air, the snow a stinging caress on his face. He swept the lodge courtyard with a practiced gaze, absorbing every movement, every shadow, every possible escape. Behind him, Atlas clawed his way to his feet, a ragged scrape on the floor. "No," Daniel commanded, his voice low and firm. "Stay." But Atlas defied him. The old dog limped into the cold, his breath already a painful mist. His gaze locked on Daniel, a look of unwavering loyalty and profound warning. Daniel paused, dropping to a crouch, and pressed his forehead to Atlas's for a fleeting moment. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "Not yet." Deeper inside the lodge, Claire was a statue of fear near the front desk, her arms crossed tightly, as if physically holding herself from shattering into a million pieces. Her carefully styled hair had fallen desperate strands, clinging to her damp cheeks. Her expression was a mask of stone, her eyes wide vacant, lost in a nightmare she had never dared to conjure. Daniel's eyes found her in an instant. For a long second, the world fell silent around them. A spark of recognition, painful and raw, flashed between them. Claire saw the grease-stained uniform, the weathered jacket, the very man she had dismissed. But Daniel didn't hesitate for an invitation. "When was the last time you saw her?" he demanded, his steady tone cutting through her haze. Claire blinked, startled. 10 minutes? She stammered. "Maybe less." "Where?" Her hand trembled as she pointed toward the trailhead. "By the trees." Daniel gave one sharp nod. He was already turning, his mind a whirlwind of calculations. At his side, Atlas stood like a monolith, ears pricked nose tasting the wind for a scent. Beyond the walls, the wind howled a mournful song. And somewhere past the tree line, a child's tiny footprints were vanishing into the snow. The grand lobby of the lodge had fractured into a mosaic of fear. Guests huddled together near the roaring fireplace, their voices a low murmur of anxious whispers. Ski patrollers stood by their radios, crackling with a tense, static-filled silence. By the front desk, Claire Whitmore swayed her knuckles white as she clung to the polished countertop, the one anchor in her capsized world. All the life had drained from her face, her lips a bloodless line, her eyes unfocused and vast with terror. The very control she clung to was already gone, lost to the chaos. Daniel, unwavering, moved toward her. "When did the call come in?" he demanded. Before Claire could speak, the front desk clerk responded. Evan Brooks, in his early 20s, was a bundle of nerves, thin with acne scarring his jaw, swallowed by a resort jacket that was 2 sizes too large. 10 minutes ago. Local authorities are en route." Daniel gave a single, sharp nod. "Where is your terrain map?" Evan pushed a laminated chart across the counter. Daniel smoothed it out his hands, a stark contrast of stillness against the surrounding chaos. His gaze scanned the forest's edge. He noted elevation contours and areas of wind exposure, then glanced out to see snow lashing sideways in the glare of the floodlights. He requested the latest weather report. Evan found it, his voice trembling faintly as he began to read. "Wind gusts are intensifying. Visibility is plummeting, the temperature dropping rapidly." Daniel let out a slow breath. In his mind, distance became time. Every slope a risk, every trail a potential trap. Standard procedure dictated a ground search starting from the last known location, fanning out in organized teams. It would require at least 3 hours just to safely penetrate the deepest parts of the woods. 3 hours in this storm was a death sentence for a 5-year-old. Daniel folded the map, returning it. "That's far too long," he said, his voice low. Claire finally found her own. "They told me help is on its way." Daniel turned to face her directly. He could see the immense effort it took to keep from shattering the tremor in her fingers that betrayed her attempt to still them. "It won't be fast enough," he stated. Stepping away, he drew his phone from his pocket. The signal was faint, but it would work. He swiped once, then pressed the call. On the 3rd ring, a voice answered, "Calm alert, life, flight, search and rescue." Daniel's posture shifted, a subtle but undeniable change as he straightened. "This is Daniel Cross," he announced. "I am requesting immediate air support near Schweitzer Mountain Resort. We have a missing child in whiteout conditions." A silence followed. "Sir, are you authorized?" Daniel shut his eyes for a moment. "I'm making a request, not giving an order." Another stretch of silence. It was longer this time. "I have worked with your organization before," Daniel pressed on, "under names you'll have on record. I would not be making this call if it weren't absolutely critical." The line fell silent again. When the voice returned, it was sharp, all business. "We're coordinating with the Boise National Guard unit. Stay on the line." Daniel cut the call, his focus immediately shifting back to Claire. "I'm going in after her," he stated, the words hanging in the air. Claire's eyes widened, a wave of disbelief crashing through her terror. "You can't. It's a blizzard out there." Daniel wasted no time on debate. Instead, he knelt before her, his voice a low, urgent anchor in the chaos. "Give me something she was wearing. Anything. Anything at all from today." Claire's hands trembled as she searched her pockets. Then she went still. She reached for the scarf she had wrapped around Lucy's shoulders just hours before. It was small and soft, impossibly so, and it still carried the lingering, phantom warmth of her child. Wordlessly, she pressed the fabric into Daniel's hands. He turned, kneeling beside Atlas. The shepherd stood taut, a tremor of anticipation running through his powerful legs. Snowflakes were already gathering in his dark fur, his gaze locked onto Daniel with an unwavering focus, sharp and full of purpose. Daniel presented the scarf. "Find her." Atlas dropped his head, took one long, deep breath, and pivoted sharply towards the tree line. He took a single step, then a second, his body straining forward with a sudden, desperate urgency. Daniel moved to a maintenance closet, grabbing his prepared gear. A high-lumen flashlight, a coil of reflective cord, a thermal wrap, and a compact first-aid kit. A multi-tool, its surface worn smooth from countless missions. He secured each piece with the fluid, thoughtless efficiency of ingrained muscle memory. Without a backward glance, Daniel and Atlas plunged into the heart of the storm. The world they knew vanished in an instant. The wind shrieked through the pines, a roar so deafening it swallowed the sound of Daniel's own breath. Icy snow bit at his exposed skin, clinging to his eyelashes and obscuring the very ground beneath his feet. Visibility collapsed to mere feet. Atlas pushed forward his nose to the snow-tail stiff. His breaths were already coming in strained, heavy pants. Every step was a battle, yet he refused to slow. He clung to the scent as if it were a lifeline, a single thread guiding him through the raging chaos. Daniel constantly corrected their course, leaning into the wind's assault, carefully navigating around unseen ledges, hidden by the deepening snow. His boot suddenly slipped on a patch of black ice, and only a last-second grab saved him from falling. He braced himself against a tree trunk, his heart pounding. Minutes bled into one another. Atlas stumbled for a moment, his strength wavering. But then he drove onward. Daniel's hand shot out instinctively, steadying his partner. "Easy, boy," he murmured, never breaking their pace. The storm answered by growing even stronger. A blizzard consumed the world, blurring the ground and sky into one. Fire coursed through Daniel's legs, while his hands turned to ice within his gloves. He glanced at his watch, shoving down the wave of dread that threatened to overwhelm him. Panic had no place here. Only precision could save them now. Just ahead, Atlas came to a dead stop. Daniel peered into the swirling abyss, following his gaze as his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his chest. "Lucy!" he screamed, but the wind stole the name from his lips. Atlas lunged forward again, his pull now desperate, his pace fueled by a terrible urgency. Daniel's knuckles went white on the leash as he plunged deeper into the tempest, keenly aware that surrender to the storm was not a choice he could make. The crevice in the rock was a cruel, narrow space barely sheltering the small child. There, Lucy lay a fragile curl against the stone, already half claimed by the drifting white. Her lips were a ghostly shade of blue, and her breathing was a faint, faltering whisper, each gasp a monumental struggle for life. One of her legs was bent unnaturally beneath her, the ankle swelling grotesquely, a prisoner to the biting cold and mounting terror. Without a moment's thought, Daniel fell to his knees beside her. "I'm here now," he whispered, his voice a low, steady anchor, carefully modulated to hide the storm of fear raging inside him. He drew Lucy's small form closer to the rock's embrace, shielding her from the relentless assault of the wind. His hands worked with a familiar, practiced grace, shrugging off his heavy outer coat and swaddling her tiny body in the thermal blanket, tucking it in tight to preserve every last flicker of her warmth. He supported her broken ankle with a gentle, deliberate pressure, slow enough to avoid causing more pain, yet firm enough to hold it secure. Atlas settled beside them, a silent guardian. The old German shepherd leaned his powerful body against Lucy's, his broad chest a bulwark against the gale. His legs braced against the tremors that shook his own frame. His breaths came in ragged, audible gasps, yet he held his ground unmoving. Snow began to gather on his back, a white shroud over his graying fur. He had become a living shield between the child and the storm's fury. Daniel laid a gloved hand on Atlas's neck for just a second, a silent thank you, a solemn vow. Then his hand found the flashlight. Its beam sliced through the white maelstrom, a brilliant, unwavering spear of light. Daniel braced himself, squaring his shoulders against the wind, and began a silent count, a rhythm as ingrained as his own breathing. 3 short bursts of light, A breath, 3 long beams, a breath, then 3 short bursts, once more SOS. He sent the silent scream into the storm over and over. He fought the wind, adjusting the angle, forcing the beam to hold steady as a chilling numbness stole the feeling from his fingers. The storm's fury was his only answer. Time stretched into an eternity. Then a faint thrumming emerged, a sound that defied the gale, the unmistakable chop of rotor blades. Daniel locked the light switching to a solid beam as a massive shadow blotted out the sky. A searchlight sliced across the treetops before it snapped violently onto his position. The punishing downdraft hit moments later, sending snow exploding outward in a violent halo. Rescue had come. Lucy was lifted first, swaddled and safely secured, her small hand finally slipping from Daniel's grasp at the medic's firm nod. "She's alive." The woman's voice was calm, practiced. Sarah Miles, in her mid-40s with a strong build and a weathered face softened by years of rescue work, moved with swift confidence. She didn't ask questions. None were needed. As the stretcher ascended, Atlas collapsed. It happened without a sound. One moment he was standing, the next his legs simply folded. Daniel caught him as he sank into the snow, pulling the dog in close, cradling Atlas's head against his own chest. "Stay with me," Daniel whispered, his forehead pressed against the dog's fur. His voice broke on a single desperate word. "Please." Atlas's eyes fluttered. His breathing was shallow, erratic. Sarah knelt beside them, already on the radio. "We have a K9 in cardiac distress. Load him now." The helicopter lifted once more, carrying both the child and her savior into the night. Inside, the hospital lights were a blinding shock after the storm. Claire Whitmore stood vigil at Lucy's bedside, her coat a forgotten heap on a chair. She hadn't moved for hours. Her dark hair hung loosely streaked with melted snow, her face a mask of raw exhaustion and profound fear. Every single breath Lucy took felt like a gift she didn't deserve. When Daniel finally entered, she turned. He seemed smaller here, somehow diminished. His clothes were stained, his hands chapped and cracked from the ordeal, his face etched with cold and weariness. Not a hero, but simply a man who didn't walk away. Claire slowly crossed the space between them, as if terrified a sudden move might shatter the fragile air. "I'm sorry," she whispered. No elaborate speech, no justification, just the words left bare and vulnerable. "I chose rules over people," she continued, her voice trembling. "I chose control out of fear, and I was wrong," Daniel admitted, shaking his head slowly. "Lucy is safe." "But that doesn't undo what I did," Claire whispered, her voice starting to break. "I sent you away when you owed me nothing, and yet you still came back for us." Daniel's gaze went past her, settling on Lucy. "Anyone would have." Claire knew deep down that wasn't true. Atlas had made it through the surgery. The heart specialist carefully explained everything, detailing medications, restrictions, the long journey ahead. "No exertion," he said, his tone absolute. "And no more storms." A faint smile touched Daniel's lips at that. In the days that followed, Daniel was a constant presence for Lucy. He never stayed for long. He arrived with no gifts. He would simply sit nearby, his presence, a quiet comfort. Atlas rested at his feet when allowed, thinner, now moving slower, but undeniably alive. Lucy reached for Daniel's hand instinctively. She told him about the blinding snow, about the overwhelming fear, and about the dog who gave her his warmth. Claire watched it unfold, feeling a profound shift inside her, quiet and irreversible. One afternoon, while Lucy was sound asleep and Atlas lay curled near the window, Claire drew Daniel into the hallway. She cradled a small box in her hands. "I don't give my trust easily," she confessed. "And I don't ask for things lightly." She opened the box, revealing a simple band. There were no diamonds meant to impress anyone, just honest metal. "I don't need a hero," Claire said softly. "I need someone who stays." "Will you stay?" Daniel's fingers closed around the ring, a surge of emotion catching in his throat. He gave a single firm nod. Yes, weeks later a man in a crisp uniform came searching for him. The commander was tall with broad shoulders, and the first hints of silver were appearing at his temples. His handshake was firm, achingly familiar. He spoke of vital skills of teams waiting. Daniel listened. Then his eyes drifted through the window to where Claire and Lucy sat in the courtyard. Atlas was stretched out peacefully at their feet. "I already have a mission," Daniel said quietly. The commander understood completely. Sometimes miracles don't come with a crash of thunder or a beacon of light from the heavens. They arrive softly through ordinary people choosing to love when it demands a sacrifice. A man who had lost everything still walked willingly into the storm. A sick old dog gave the last of his fading strength to keep a small child warm. A mother learned that you can't control trust, you can only give it. If there was a true miracle that night, it was so much more than just the rescue. It was the undeniable proof that a higher power still works through human hands, through unwavering courage, through boundless mercy, through the solemn choice to stay. In our own lives, we may never face a blizzard of this magnitude, but we all face moments when another soul is in desperate need, where doing what is right demands so much more than just walking away. May you be blessed for watching. May He protect your loved ones, guide you on your path, and place people in your life who will never, ever leave you behind. If this story has deeply moved you, please share it with someone who might be searching for hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are joining us from. And please don't forget to subscribe so we can continue to share stories that prove goodness is still a powerful force in this world. May God truly bless you.